Over 60% of Zambians are living in poverty, and over 42%, according to a study that was done in 2017, are living below the poverty line. This is Bizweek, and the name is Winston Mavor. My host this evening is Mr. Justin Mukosa from the Rural Electrification Authority. He is the Corporate Affairs Manager, and today we will be talking about the issue of electricity, the role of electricity in national development. Mr. Mukosa, just to get into the subject of discussion this evening, first of all, we know that poverty is extremely high in rural areas, and electricity plays a crucial role to be able to mitigate that. So, how important is electricity to reducing poverty in those particular rural areas where you do work and implement your projects quite often?
Yeah. Watson, first of all, let me say thank you very much for inviting us. This is my first time to be here, so it's a great opportunity for us as rural electrification to get such opportunities. To start with, maybe just to give you an idea of how the rural electrification program was initiated by government in the mid-90s, going into the late 90s. One of the things that happened then was that there was this process of commercializing the National Electricity Utility Company, which is ZESCO. And that meant that there was a gap in terms of provision of electricity infrastructure in rural areas. Because essentially what that entailed was that the focus for ZESCO changed to areas where provision of these facilities were economically viable, such as urban centers. So it left a gap in terms of development of the electricity infrastructure in rural areas. So government created a structure called the Rural Electrification Program, which is being administered by the Rural Electrification Authority under an Act of Parliament. And essentially, the issue is to increase access to electricity. From the end, statistics were indicating that we were at 3% in terms of access to electricity by rural communities, to 51% by 2030, in line with the Vision 2030. Now, the essence of putting in this structure was basically because electricity is one of the key catalysts to development. Without electricity, there are a lot of areas that have remained hindered in terms of development. If you look at what is happening now in terms of the dynamics of development and the pronouncements by government, you find that whenever a place is opened up for development, such as a new districts, there's always demand for electricity because it's one of the key components of development. And here we are talking about a number of sectors that benefit from electricity. Some of these are social sectors, such as education and indeed health. And here we are talking about efficiency in terms of service delivery. In rural areas, you find that where electricity is unavailable, services are actually nothing to go by. In terms of the standards in education, they are quite low because the service delivery is limited by so many factors, such as connectivity to things like ICTs, to things like internet, to study hours, to teacher retention issues, to staff retention issues in these sectors, etc., etc. So electricity provides for efficient service delivery in these sectors.
Okay, I love the fact that you've mentioned that electricity does improve service delivery, especially in rural areas. Now, we've noticed that when you do a comparison between urban areas and rural areas, you'll find that there's quite a huge margin when it comes to development.
Yeah.
In urban areas, you seem to have development that is miles ahead compared to rural areas. So, does electricity expedite development in rural areas to ensure that they also catch up?
Exactly. If you look at the 7th National Development Plan, there are actually certain targets that have been defined under there in terms of poverty reduction. And some of these targets actually hinge on provision of reliable sources of energy, and electricity being the key source of energy. If you look at we are here looking at opening up these areas for development. And like I was pointing out, if you look at the economic sectors, nobody is willing to go into the rural areas to invest in an area which has no source of energy to begin with. So the moment these areas are provided with that source of energy, which is electricity, they begin opening up, not only to the local entrepreneurship activities within the local areas, such as maybe welding, opening up of businesses, opening up of barber shops, saloons, etc., refrigeration, but also opening up for external investment. This is where a situation where you see there's external investment of various natures coming into these areas. So essentially, the rural electrification program in Zambia was meant not only to increase access, but also to make these areas productive, to make these areas start contributing to the overall GDP of the nation. Because in most cases you find, like you rightly pointed out in terms of statistics, the majority of the Zambians actually reside in rural areas. And these have the capacity to contribute to the national economic development as long as they have the necessary infrastructure, and one of them being electricity.
Okay. Recently, you did launch the Electricity Service and Access Project, abbreviated as ISAP, and would like to understand what is the scope of this particular important project. I mean, I remember very well that, the World Bank really, esteemed this project quite high.
Yeah. Well, Watson, this is a credit facility that has been negotiated between the World Bank and the government of the Republic of Zambia through the Rural Electrification Authority. And essentially what this entails is that there's a credit facility of up to $26.8 million US dollars that is going to be pumped into strategies of increasing access to electricity in rural areas. Now, this is a project which is going to be run over a period of 5 years. And essentially it has 3 broad components, and I'll just quickly go through these components. There's component A, B, and C. I'll start with C. And in a nutshell, C basically looks at developing a national electrification strategy for rural areas in Zambia. That is one, basically that. And component B looks at review of the current provisions in terms of legislation, legislation and the provisions that relate to regulating the electricity industry, and specifically rural electrification in Zambia. This component is looking at financing mechanism to entice the private sector to participate in the electricity subsector, because you know that right now electricity subsector is not so lucrative. People are talking about issues of low tariff, and so the private sector is not so willing to come into to invest in a sector that is not so lucrative for them, because for them it's money, it's making profits. But the most exciting component of the ISAP is component 1. And component 1 basically is looking at providing a subsidy. Because what we've realized is that in these rural areas where the infrastructure has already been taken, the uptake of electricity by the intended beneficiaries has not been so much. You find a project that has been perhaps implemented 5 years down the line, there are only few facilities that have connected, and basically because of one thing, the capacity of the financial capacity of the beneficiaries to connect, because the connection fees in urban areas are not differentiated. What you pay if you want to connect here at household level is something like 1,500. And now what government has done is that they've attached a subsidy to that, such that if you are going to connect in the households within the private households in rural areas are now going to connect at a subsidized fee of 250 kwacha. And so they will have to go to ZESCO and get connected. And this is going to be administered over a period of 5 years. And for what we are calling small and medium enterprises, they are going to connect at 769 kwacha. So if you have a small shop in a rural area or a small commercial undertaking, you only have to go to ZESCO and pay 769. So this is a subsidy that is being provided in all these areas where we have implemented rural electrification projects, and also there's those areas in rural areas where ZESCO has also undertaken projects. The target, what's on here, is that we want to, by the end of the project, to connect somewhere around 22,000 households and plus or minus 1,000 small and medium enterprises. But the indications right now are showing that because this project goes up to 2022, right now, before even going into half of the project, we've already managed to connect 9,000 private households. So it is an encouraging opportunity for Zambians that are residing in rural areas to actually connect to electricity. But it's not just a matter of connecting to electricity. We've put in place a structure that is going to encourage the load centers, or where these beneficiaries are, to actually use this electricity productively. Electricity in rural areas, the point is not just for lighting or entertainment.
I was actually coming
Yes.
to that, you know.
The point actually that we always do this community mobilization in rural areas before a project is implemented, where the emphasis is put on productive uses of electricity. And this is why I was talking about the small locally based entrepreneurship activities. So that is an exciting project for us, and we are hoping that at the end of the project we would actually have administered more than the target that we are aiming at of 22,000 households, private households.
Okay, so recently you did, you know, sign a memorandum of understanding with World Vision, and this particular MOU, you know, aims at improving, you know, access to electricity in rural areas, as you have mentioned. And one of the things that was mentioned by, you know, the Chief Executive Officer for the Rural Electrification Authority, Pastor John from Sonda, is that, you know, there will be an emphasis so that this electricity is used economically.
Yeah.
Okay, now I remember at the time there was just the signing, and then development of the frameworks and all these modalities would begin.
Yeah.
How far, or how is that project unfolding?
Yeah, I'll talk about that program in broad terms. Apart from World Vision, there are other stakeholders that fall within the same structure, because what it is that we developed a program or a strategy of working with partner organizations that work directly with certain structures within rural communities, World Vision being one of them. By example, I can also say the Citizens Economic Empowerment Commission, and also the Zambia Development Agency, just a few examples. So it's a structure where we are looking at who can we partner with and deliver infrastructure, electricity infrastructure, using their frameworks. Because if you look at also one of them is NGOCC. They already have structures within rural communities where perhaps you might find an activity that is lacking the presence of electricity as a source of energy. These are broad service level agreements where we haven't defined specific projects, but there are potential projects that would exist within these agreements, where an institution then like World Vision would say, okay, we have identified a certain project where we think that you can provide, for instance, a subsidy for us to provide electricity to this particular activity within their framework of work. So they are broad kind of service agreements, which will then narrow down to specific projects that will be identified and agreed upon then with specific conditions when it comes to the implementation strategies. So we are glad that we are going that way because we need, rural electrification is a social program, and we get funding mainly from government. But we need to have synergies where we can explore as many possibilities as possible for us to meet that 51% target that I was talking about in terms of access to electricity. So we are depending on our sister stakeholders like World Vision and these MOUs or service level agreements that we are signing for us to explore all possible opportunities to reach out so that we can hit that 51% by 2030.
Okay. Now, what kind of project is, RIA currently implementing in rural areas that promotes the agenda of diversification in the energy sector, as has been the core, by several important stakeholders, and several studies have been done to show that there is need to diversify the energy mix in Zambia?
Yes. What it is first of all to say that the mainstay for rural electrification in terms of the technology that we've been using is grid extension, and this basically means that our main projects are based on grid extension, just extending the ZESCO grid from point A to point B, which is an identified rural growth center or a village, so to say. But we've seen the challenges that have come with grid extension projects. We've just passed through a passage of what commonly referred to as load shedding because of climatic factors and etc. etc. So we have within what we call the Rural Electrification Master Plan provision for us to explore other possibilities of generating electricity. And one of these is off-grids, and we are leaning more onto solar as a source of electricity, especially in areas where grid extension is not possible. So we are now developing what we are calling solar standalone solar mini grids. We've done a project in Zambia, and it's supplying power to about 420 households.
That's
in
a solar
village.
project.
That's a solar project. It's a mini grid where electricity is generated by a centralized power station. You have a solar field, you have a battery bank, and it's been evacuated to these houses using a grid or these power lines that you see, but it's been generated by solar. Apart from that, we recently did a study in collaboration with the University of Zambia of trying to find out whether we can generate electricity using wind. And we did this on Lunga district in Luapula province. And the results are actually very positive as of now. The initial indications are such that we can actually generate, at that particular point, up to a capacity of 1 megawatt. So right now we are moving into the second stage of trying to develop a power station. And Lunga district is a district where it's a cluster of islands with a main island where the only possible perhaps source of energy would be solar and wind. So wind has given us an opportunity to do a hybrid on that island to provide electricity. So we know that wind can provide electricity in Zambia. We know that we have abundance of sunshine in Zambia, and those are the main sources. But we also undertaking studies in terms of biomass. Right now, I can only say that right now we are at study level, depending on how fast we move with these studies, we shall be announcing maybe that we are going this way also. So all those opportunities are existing in Zambia, especially the solar energy program, which is more on the expansion on our side. We're doing two more this year, solar mini grids. I mentioned Lunga, we have a project there. We are going to power Lunga district using solar. And then we have another project, a solar mini grid, which is at 200 kilowatts in a place called Chunga in the Kafue National Park. In the Kafue National Park, we have actually advanced. We've done the civil works. We are going now into the technical equipment. This means procurement of solar panels, batteries, and all those associated with the grid. So in terms of diversification, we need to diversify because we do not have control over climate change issues to a huge extent. And this is why I was saying, if you look at the past, we've passed through a very uncomfortable phase where perhaps even a common person like you and I, at one point, tend solar. You would move in a household, you find people have bought maybe solar lamps, and it actually it could have even been maybe a blessing in disguise for people now to start appreciating solar as a source of energy. So that diversification program is there at RIA.
Okay, so as we get to conclude our discussion, unfortunately, this evening, Mr. Mukosa, is, the Rural Electrification Authority, obviously has got quite an ambitious target that would significantly contribute positively to the development trajectory of Zambia, and that is, ensuring that 51% of Zambians in rural areas have access to electricity by 2030, if I'm not mistaken. Now, to achieve that, you need money.
Yeah.
Do you have adequate funding to be able to achieve this ambitious, bodacious, achievable target?
Definitely not. There's what is called, I mentioned earlier on, that we have put in place what is called the Rural Electrification Master Plan. And this was a study that was done countrywide, and it came out with about 1,217 rural growth centers that have to be electrified in order for us to reach that target by 2030. It also attached a figure in terms of how much we need on an annual phase or per year, which is $50 million US. But certainly we don't get that amount of funding. I earlier on said that the government funds most of the program. So we get monies from Parliament appropriation through the national budget, which is the main funding opportunity for us. And then we also have what we call 3% electricity levy that is paid on the bill that you pay to ZESCO. The bill that you and I pay to ZESCO, there's a 3% that is called electricity levy that comes for purposes of rural electrification, and obviously there are loans and grants. So in a nutshell, we don't reach that level of funding. Okay. Perhaps we only come to give you a picture, just like maybe 1/3 of what is required each year. That's why we have backlogs every time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for coming through, Mr.
Watson.
Justin
Yeah.
Mukosa, to this week to discuss the role of electricity in national development. And of course, it is not enough to ensure that people have access to electricity in rural areas, but it is imperative that these people use this particular electricity for productive issues that will be able to improve their lives economically and also open up those particular areas to more development and investment. The name is Wenton Mavoro. You've been watching Biz Week, and my guest has been Mr. Justin Mukosa from the Rural Electrification Authority.